Who wanted a railroad built across America? The sunburnt immigrant walking with his wife and little ones beside his gaunt and weary oxen. The sea traveler, seasick and bored on the endless waves. The homesick bride whose wedding trip crossed the Isthmus of Panama. The merchant who needed to replenish his goods. The miner who wanted to return home. The Sierra Nevada stands there like a dare. Cross me, they say. And that's what Sacramento, a town of 13,000 people on the western edge of the continent, would have to do if it wanted a link to the rest of the nation by rail. This is the story of how it happened. This is the story of how the people of Sacramento built the railroad across the nation.
The Transcontinental Railroad started at the foot of K Street right here in Sacramento.
The Transcontinental Railroad started in Sacramento. It started over a year before anything started in Omaha with the Union Pacific. I don't think the rest of the country realizes that this Sacramento was the start of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Sacramento was the birthplace of the West and the home of three globe-altering events: the Gold Rush, the Transcontinental Railroad, and the birth of hydroelectric transmitted power.
What makes the Transcontinental Railroad unique is it cut its own course, particularly through the Sierra, and they were driven by engineering requirements of gradient and snow, but they didn't follow existing roads. They had to create a new road.
The story starts with the Gold Rush, which sparked one of the largest human migrations in history. People from around the world raced to California as fast as they could to start a new life, leaving friends and family far behind. But the journey was long and dangerous and involved crossing oceans or hundreds of miles of barren deserts and stupendous mountains.
It's isolated from the rest of the population by 2,000 miles of mountains and desert, or by 15,000 miles of sea.
We were the wild, wild west. We were out here in the middle of nowhere.
Sacramento became a major supply center for the gold miners. Roads had to be built into the foothills to ship the shovels, picks, food, and materials by wagon. The gold was then shipped back to Sacramento.
There was a vast amount of stuff being transported back and forth, and the roads were terrible. In the winter they were muddy, and in the summer they were dusty.
An enterprising businessman, Charles Lincoln Wilson, saw an opportunity. Wilson operated a river steamer between Sacramento and San Francisco. He realized if he could build a railroad from Sacramento north to Marysville, he could control the trade of one of the most gold-rich regions in California, the famous Mother Lode. But there were no railroads in California. Who could design and build it? In 1854, Wilson learned of a bright young engineer in New York State.
Theodore Judah, in today's language, would probably be considered a child prodigy. At the age of 11, he enrolled in Rensselaer Institute in New York and quickly rose through the ranks until such time as he was actually the associate engineer in charge of construction of the Niagara Gorge Railroad in New York.
Wilson brought Judah to Sacramento, and he was able to build the first railroad in the West, the Sacramento Valley Railroad. The line ran from R Street in Sacramento to Folsom.
But today, passengers can ride from Sacramento all the way into the heart of historic Folsom along the very route of the very first railroad in the West by riding the Gold Line of regional transit here.
In February 1856, the railroad officially opened with VIPs taking the 90-minute train ride to Folsom. They partied all night in a hotel ballroom. Then, weary, took the train back to Sacramento at dawn. Folsom keeps the memory alive today, preserving the depot building, train cars, the first turntable in the West, and a mural depicting the glory days. This replica roundhouse will hold a restaurant and office. But Theodore Judah had much bigger plans than just building a short rail line.
Theodore Judah was an absolutely inspired, obsessed railroad engineer. He loved what he was doing, and he had a desire to an ambitious desire to make a name as being the guy who literally created and solved the riddle of the Transcontinental Railroad that had been being chased for decades.
Others in the West had the same dream. A dozen cities from the Washington Territory to San Diego, envisioning great riches, competed to be the home of the railroad. But Judah was an engineer, a lobbyist, and a public relations genius. He found no support in San Francisco. The big money in San Francisco was predominantly Democrat, much of it supporting the South in the time leading up to the Civil War. Many of those Democrats favored a southern transcontinental route, not the central route recommended by Judah. Gold Rush Sacramento created enormous wealth, and a prosperous class of businessmen emerged.
These were pioneering businessmen. It wasn't just normal business as we would think of business, you know, whether it was groceries or clothing or hardware, implements, any kind of thing.
The business people, sometimes called the Big Four, but there are really 5 of them if you include folks like E.B. Crocker, they were abolitionists. It was their belief in the elimination of slavery that encouraged them to form the California Republican Party and to support Abraham Lincoln. They were business people. They came here to California to make money and start their businesses, and they saw the business opportunities that were possible by creation of a railroad that connected them directly with eastern markets as well as with the Pacific.
They took a huge risk. It was their money initially that was funding it, and even though in the 1862 Railroad Act provided funds for financing it, until that time it was all their money, and it was a huge risk, much greater than I think they're given credit for.
The wealthy merchants were joined by saloon owners, shopkeepers, and workers who bought small amounts of stocks and bonds to get the project started. Now that he had the initial investors, Judah needed to get the federal government involved.
And he actually set up an office in the old vice president's office in the Capitol that was a museum of, it included maps, it included drawings that his wife Anna had done of flora and fauna from the Sierras, and it was a center for the congressman to come in and ask questions, and he used his charming personality to help sell the Transcontinental Railroad.
But what people don't realize is that guy personally, at his own expense, made 3 trips back and forth from Sacramento to Washington, D.C. to lobby for that train.
His passion was the Transcontinental. He was very intense, very self-confident, dressed well, and projected well. He was friendly. People liked him. He was actually the perfect engineer for the job.
Early Union defeats in the Civil War rattled many in the North, but Abraham Lincoln was determined to keep the nation united.
Abraham Lincoln's vision encompassed, in 43 days in 1862, 4 significant acts that were passed: the Homestead Act, the Telegraph and Railroad Acts, and the College Land Grant Act.
Abraham Lincoln signed the bill approving the construction of the railroad. The question was, where would it begin? San Franciscans assumed it would start in their city. After all, they were on the ocean, and the bill even said that it would be built there. But there was another clause in the legislation, and it read, or at the navigable waters of the Sacramento River. The San Francisco critics howled. How could this be? The same thieves that had stole the state capitol had now swiped the railroad. Judah listened to the critics, smiled, and said he'd cut San Francisco in, but he never did. I guess that proves that you have to pass the bill to really see what's in it.
This mural shows the Central Pacific's groundbreaking ceremony held along the Sacramento River in January 1863. There will be no delay, no halting, no uncertainty in its continued progress, one speaker confidently predicted. This despite the fact that all the rails and locomotives had to be shipped thousands of miles from the east to Sacramento to build the railroad. Central Pacific President Leland Stanford said, "We may now look forward with confidence to the day, not far distant, when the Pacific will be bound to the Atlantic by iron bonds."
Judah, at a very early age, of course, working his way on up as an engineer, he was surrounded by a kind of a swirl of interest that was growing and developing about building a railroad across the continent. But the biggest challenges were the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. Most people thought there was no way a railroad could ever be built in those.
In 1860 and 1861, Judah traveled up and down the Central Sierra. He had to find the best route over the mountains. The route he chose rose from sea level to more than 7,000 feet in just 70 miles. But it had three major advantages. It passed near to major rivers, which provided water for the steam engines. It passed near forests, which provided plenty of timber to be used to construct the giant trestles and bridges. And rock and stone, used to line the rail beds and construct culverts, was plentiful.
Accomplishing getting across the Sierra was difficult on foot, was difficult by wagon, and was nearly impossible by railroad. What makes the Transcontinental Railroad unique is it cut its own course, particularly through the Sierra, and they were driven by engineering requirements of gradient and snow, but they didn't follow existing roads. They, for the first time in history, had to create a new road.
By building a constant grade and keeping the grade down to a reasonable level, in this case it was dictated to be 116 feet per mile, about 2.2%. The operating costs of the railroad were less, building it up essentially a ramp, going from Sacramento or Roseville all the way to Donner Pass.
Theodore Judah looked at 5 or 6 different routes over the Sierra, but it was Doc Strong of Dutch Flat who brought him up here to look at Donner Pass. And he analyzed the route and he thought that this would be the best way to get over the Sierra, although he'd have to do it through 15 tunnels.
This monument in Sacramento pays tribute to Judah's great accomplishment. Judah never got to see the masterpiece he created. He died of yellow fever in late 1863. Just 37 years old, 6 years before the railroad was completed. But the greatest testament to his vision is the route, which continues to operate on the same line to this day. The route created a necklace of towns that stretch across the foothills and the Sierra into Nevada. In Sacramento, you will see immense brick buildings, the remnants of an era when this site was a rail car production and maintenance facility that was once the largest industrial center west of the Mississippi. These are the first industrial buildings in California. They date to 1867. At the peak of activity, during World War II, more than 7,000 people worked here.
About a third of Sacramento's workforce worked in the shops or for the railroad in some form. So think of it as equal to the state of California as a regional employer today. The shops were 19th century high-tech industry. Everything was built there. Locomotives were built from the ground up, the only place west of the Mississippi where people built these things. So these were skilled tradespeople, skilled workers from all sorts of backgrounds who came here in order to get a good job, a high-paying job in these industries. Railroad employment reached all portions of the United States, from African-American porters and red caps and chefs in the dining cars, to Chinese railroad workers who helped construct the railroad and maintain it, to Latino workers who helped with track maintenance and construction. This was a multicultural exercise, and it's not always recognized as that. Also, during World War I and World War II, women worked in the shops, so they broke barriers for women's employment, too.
Just 20 miles northeast of Sacramento is Roseville. The giant Roseville Yard is the largest rail facility on the West Coast. It handles 98% of all of Northern California's train traffic.
Roseville was a frontier. It was the American frontier, the epitome of the West, with pioneers here. The railroad ushered in the industrial age at the same time that it was ushering out the American frontier and all of its pioneers.
Just 12 miles up the hill from Roseville is Newcastle. Here you can see the large sheds used to process fruit packed for shipment to the east. The Transcontinental Railroad opened the way for California's fruits and vegetables to be shipped to the market in America. Climbing to about 1,000 feet, you come to Auburn and a tight spot called Bloomer Cut. It was one of the first engineering challenges the railroad faced. The cut is an engineering marvel and a testament to the strength and determination of the laborers who built it. The workers used black powder to blast through the hill, building a tunnel without a top. The cut is 800 feet long, and the workers excavated more than 45,000 cubic yards of earth and rock. They used shovels, picks, and wagons. Trains run through the cut to this day. Cape Horn is a high, rocky promontory about half a mile north of Colfax. It offers spectacular views of the American River Canyon. The trains would stop at Cape Horn and tourists would get out and walk to the side of a cliff for a first look at California's scenery. It was around this time, mid-1865, that the Central Pacific began hiring large numbers of Chinese workers. Chinese had come to California in 1849, joining thousands of others in the gold fields. They earned a reputation as hard workers and were recruited to work on the railroad. A legend maintained that Chinese were hung off the side of Cape Horn in wicker baskets to build the line along the cliff face. While this was not true, the story illustrated the importance of the Chinese in building the railroad. By the time the railroad was finished, an estimated 10,000 Chinese had worked on it.
The Central Pacific's Chinese workers had the toughest task. They had to build the railroad through the granite rock of the Sierra Nevada. Some died and were injured in explosions, accidents, or avalanches.
We're really talking about hand tools. We're talking about picks and shovels, and that's what they're building the railroad with. They're using black powder for blasting. They're using wheelbarrows and one-horse carts to move the dirt. They're loading the carts up by hand. Up higher, probably one of the greatest achievements was the Summit Tunnel, built with hand tools, drilling the mountains out, and really successfully building that tunnel completed well in advance of when they thought it would be completed. Even at that, it took well over a year and a half to build the tunnel. Drilling the tunnels and blasting, they're using what's called double jack drilling. In double jack drilling, one person stands with a big drill steel held up against the mountain, and the other guy has a sledgehammer and he's swinging and he's hitting that drill steel with it, and that's how they're drilling the holes. And then they fill them up with black powder, or at the Summit Tunnel also nitroglycerin, and set off the blast and then go clear the rubble and do it again.
Today, Truckee has become a center of California's ski industry. Its main street lined with restaurants and boutiques. But until the railroad broke through the summit, it was a remote outpost.
Donner Summit is the most historically significant square mile in California and maybe the entire western United States. The hardest part of the journey was crossing the Sierra. And the hardest part of building the railroad was crossing the Sierra and Donner Summit.
Well, coming down, they still had to maintain a 2.5% grade because that was a requirement of the Pacific Railroad Act. And so they had to maintain that. They had a number of tunnels that they had to get through. And the biggest tunnel was, of course, Tunnel 6, Donner Summit Tunnel. But they had 7 more tunnels that they had to make through as they came down, trying to maintain this 2.5% grade or less. That was a big problem for them.
The tunnel was holed through August 30th, 1867, and the first locomotive chugged through the tunnels in November. You can see how the line loops downward on the ridge from the summit around Donner Lake towards Truckee.
There was a dramatic change in Truckee once the route was completed. They had this major roundhouse, and this was used to switch locomotives so they could have extra locomotives to push these trains or pull these trains all the way up to the top of Donner Summit. And this really caused a big boom in the economic life of Truckee. And more shops were built, and it became a major place on the railroad.
It had taken 5 years to complete the 154 miles of track from Sacramento to Reno. It took just 10 months to build the remaining 536 miles to Promontory, Utah. The Union Pacific met the Central Pacific May 10, 1869. This picture is one of the most iconic images in American history, the joining of East and West at Promontory. The Central Pacific held a special celebration for its Chinese workers.
Sacramento Daily Bee, May 12, 1869. Mr. Stobridge, when the work was all over, invited the Chinese to dine at his boarding car. Mr. Stobridge introduced his Chinese foreman and leader, who had been with him so long, and took the head of the table. All the guests and officers present cheered them as the chosen representatives of the race, which have greatly helped to build the road. A tribute they well deserved, and which evidently gave them much pleasure.
The first passengers were members of an Army detachment that noted the superior construction of the Central Pacific.
We ran like lightning at a frightful speed. Made 200 miles last night. On we rushed without a stop. All remark on how well this road is built. Certainly 50% better than the UP. The CPs don't mean to keep us long in their road. They halt for nothing. Captain John Charles Currier, U.S. Army.
Sacramento did it. They had defied the critics, taken the bit, and built what no one thought could be built. Just 4 years after the end of the bitter and bloody Civil War, their work bound the nation in a healing embrace. With the Transcontinental completed, many Americans felt the nation had fulfilled its manifest destiny to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. This famous painting, American Progress, has come to represent the spirit of Western expansion.
Well, the railroad is critical to the opening of California to the country and the country to California. It also opened California to trade from Asia. And with the coming of the railroad, you developed whole new industries in California. You had the lumbering industry come along, that's obvious, but they also began developing orchards and farms in the Central Valley. And it was the advent of refrigerated cars, first with ice in them, that enabled those products to get all the way across the country.
All of a sudden, life became a lot more efficient, and our economy completely changed at that point. First and foremost, the Pacific Fruit Express, which is an artificial ice plant, actually came here in 1909, the largest artificial ice plant in the world. So we had people from all over the world coming here to learn how we actually manufactured artificial ice. There wasn't any electricity in those days. But we needed a way to ship this produce across the United States. Now that the Transcontinental was in full operation, our produce was being shipped quite readily and quite frequently across the United States. So the Pacific Fruit Express, the ice plant, employed hundreds and hundreds of people here. And the switching yards also employed hundreds and hundreds of people here. So the railroad employed the majority of the people through the years.
We were really the place where that connection to, in many cases, what you'd call the American dream started. That dream of connecting a nation, of unifying it politically as well as economically via transportation. Via what had been a months-long trip became a week-long trip. Instead of feeling like you were isolated in this place, California, that took months to get to, you were a week away from your relatives in Chicago or New York, and they were that much closer to you. So it still influences the face of Sacramento, the face of California, and the legacy of the United States.
What I see as the legacy is the Transcontinental Railroad and the ability to move large amounts of people or freight in such rapid time was really the technology that led to greater technology. A lot of people point to the airplane, as being the real beginning of modern technology, but I think the railroad and the ability to carve mountains to fit your purpose, and that's what had to be done with the Sierra. You couldn't just cross the Sierra, you had to go through the Sierra. And that ability of humanity to change its environment for technological purposes is what led to the future we see now and the present that we have.
The completion of the railroad created the pledge and the prayer that endures to this day. May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world.